Hello, welcome to Freedom Worldwide. I'm Tom Palmer with Atlas Network,
broadcasting from Damascus, Syria. Yes, from what local people call free Syria, freed from the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad, but freed also of the effective occupation of their country by Iran's Revolutionary Guards, by their allies in Hezbollah, and by the Russian army and their merciless Wagner mercenaries. That takes us to the topic, speaking of the neighbors, of Iran, where the authoritarian regime there is seeing its legitimacy and power slipping away. Every day, Iranians on the street are rejecting official propaganda and have even refused to take part in state-sponsored compulsory demonstrations in favor of terrorist organizations in other countries. Although they still face severe government repression, the freedom movement in the country is growing as more and more people come in contact with the ideas of free markets and individual rights, the philosophy known as classical liberalism. The regime's waning strength has created a unique opportunity for the growing pro-freedom movement in Iran and across the region to advance peace, prosperity, and human dignity. My guest today has been the center of that movement in Iran for many years. He got out of Iran in 2021 to Spain and has been since 2022 a senior researcher at the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a regular commentator on Persian language television and has written widely on the history of markets, industry, and business in Iran, on public policy, including detailed studies of regulation, of financial markets, pensions, and similar topics. And he's translated many seminal works in the classical liberal and free market traditions into Persian. So it's my pleasure to welcome to us Mohamad Machine-Chian. Mohamad, welcome to Freedom Worldwide.
Thank you very much.
What's the status quo in Iran and the hold that the regime has on the country now that they've lost their control over Syria? What do you see happening?
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity. I see glimpses of hope, to be honest with you. Even though the Ayatollah refuses to acknowledge his series of defeats, and again, just recently, a few days ago, he pledged rebuilding and renewal of all the infrastructure and their forces in the region.
We do see that there are elections in Iran. There's a question then, does that make Iran a democracy?
That's a great question. And well, yes, the regime in Iran has a pretense of democracy. And Ayatollah Khomeini ordered people to show up for elections just to give the regime an aura of legitimacy. But after that, Iranian people gradually learned they tried to use elections to reform the country. It took Iranian people 30 years to realize that they couldn't really change the country through elections. To begin with, there's a silent confirmation process before even you can run for any public office in Iran. So basically, when you try to run, when you want to run, you announce your interest, and the regime goes and vets you, and they may or may not allow you to run. And so Iranian people tried to cultivate those, even because you couldn't run for office from outside of the body of the regime, but they tried to cultivate the differences between different factions inside the regime. But even then, the regime started to disqualify even high-ranking officials. For example, the former president, two-term president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, he was disqualified, and he was a member of the Expediency Council. He was head of the parliament before several times, and he was president twice. Even President Ahmadinejad, the two-term president, he tried to run just in the last election. He was disqualified. Even the current president, President Pezeshkian, the last time they wanted to appoint President Raisi. He was disqualified the last election, but this time around they told him to run, and he was qualified, and he was appointed president. So Iranian people tried everything. We tried to reform the country through elections, but it became quite apparent that we couldn't go that route. So no, to answer your question, it's not a democracy by any means. And it is a democracy. The system is one man, one vote. The Ayatollah is that man. He has the vote. So that's the way it is structured.
So understood. So although they have the formal mechanisms of going and voting, it's effectively meaningless. The choice has already been made for them. Now, a question that the regime claims as a part of its tradition that they rely on a long tradition of Islamic statecraft and have even a theological foundation. So a question that rises is, how credible is that? I know that it's rejected as a fantasy by many, many Muslim clerics, including other senior religious scholars in the tradition that is dominant in Iran, including Ayatollahs who opposed Khomeini's establishment of what they called an allegedly Islamic regime, and many who continue to oppose it. How do you see that in terms of the legitimacy of the Iranian state?
Absolutely, that's a very good point. And yes, the highest ranking Ayatollahs in Shia Islam in our contemporary history are most of them are on record rejecting the idea of political Islam and the ideas behind Khomeinism. So it is important to point out that Khomeinism was a new invention. And there are proto-ideas back in history, but never put to practice and never took seriously. So the orthodoxy in Shia Islam has always been quietism, the doctrine of quietism. So basically the Ayatollahs stayed away from matters of politics. And their understanding was this is to keep the faith of people from being damaged by matters of politics and expediency. And that is exactly what happened after the revolution. You mentioned high-ranking Ayatollahs, and that is exactly true. In fact, the teacher of Ayatollah Khomeini, when he started his political ambitions, his teacher rejected that idea. He put the idea to his teacher. He was the highest-ranking Ayatollah at the time in Iran. He refused, and he rejected that idea, and his successor also rejected it, and we have the chain up until now. The only Ayatollahs in Iran who affirm Khomeinism and his ideas are the ones basically on the payroll of the regime. And it is, so I think I answered the question.
Yes, and I know that I've heard from other Muslim clerics also from Iran who said, the purpose of the state is to be just, not to force people to be religious. The purpose of religion is to help people to be good, and good people will demand a just state. But that in effect, Khomeinism has put the state above God, which they say is a fundamental betrayal of their religion. You know, if you were authentically divinely guided or governed by those who had truly divine guidance, you'd think everything would turn out well. But what's the actual situation in Iran now, economically and socially? Has the Supreme Leader Khamenei's leadership led to widespread prosperity, or are the usual laws of supply and demand applicable in theocracies as well?
This is very interesting because the Ayatollah for the past 35 years, the current Ayatollah, Khamenei, for the past 35 years, he has been waging his Don Quixote war on the windmills. Basically, his whole narrative, rhetoric, is around fighting the Western sciences, as he puts it. Basically, he understands modern economics as the achievement of the West imposed upon the Eastern Iranian people and so forth, even though we know for a fact that all achievements of human civilizations are the result of trade of not only goods and services, but also ideas. But he doesn't see it like that. He rejects those ideas in return in its place. He has proposed certain ideas, for example, which has created fascinating results. For example, he emphasizes resistance and self-sufficiency. By doing so, basically rejecting comparative advantage. So even he rejects principal ideas of modern economics, to the detriment of Iranian people, of course. As the result, there are all sorts of scarcity, that prices are, even though we have price fixing in every good that you can imagine, nonetheless, the economy doesn't work, and it is very apparent to Iranian people who have lived it for so long. They understand it, that centrally planned economy doesn't work. The prescriptions of the Ayatollah, this war against the windmills, isn't really fruitful, hasn't really been fruitful for them. And that is one of the reasons that Iranian people are so actively looking for alternative ideas.
It's interesting, I think, a vindication of the idea that principles of supply and demand and fundamental economics apply everywhere, regardless of your language, religious faith, ethnicity, and so on. But what's interesting in the Iranian case is the use of price controls, which leads inevitably to shortages. And that's especially a surprise because they clothe their dictatorship in the garb of Islam, when in fact the Prophet Muhammad, who founded and inspired the religion, is reported in a very authoritative hadith as saying, when people came and said, you should control the prices in the market, he said, prices are in God's hands. And that he wanted to be able to meet God without having to answer for some injustice that he might commit. So freedom of exchange has long been played a central role in the Islamic civilization and regions of the world. And we should note that this was a religion that was promulgated and advanced by a merchant who understood fundamental principles of economics.
Absolutely. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini criticized traditional Ayatollahs at the time, before the revolution, for their capitalist ways. Not only Ayatollah Khomeini, because remember, Ayatollah Khomeini was the founder, the leader of the revolution, but there was another person, the teacher of the revolution, called Ali Shariati. He grew up in the movement of God-fearing socialists. And so he also criticized and he was very influential on what became the revolution of 1979. He was also very critical of the Ayatollahs, because remember, Ayatollahs were a decentralized network of competing jurisdictions and overlapping jurisdictions. And Ayatollahs lived very lavish lifestyles, and they had very close ties to Baghdad, to the merchant class. And they were funded by the merchant class. And Khomeini hated this, that they, with the Ayatollahs, were at the mercy of the merchant class. So basically, he adopted Marxist-Leninist framework as the basis of his political structure, because the political structure before that was not present in Shia Islam. But he instituted that, and they came up with this Islamic Republic that you see these days. But in doing so, they had to go around very carefully the Prophet of Islam, because even the Prophet and his sayings and his demeanor and his lifestyle became the antithesis of the Islamic Republic. And of course, for the past 20 years, we have been talking about that. We have been talking about that legacy. And it has been very embarrassing and uncomfortable for the regime to tolerate that, because on one hand, they cannot censor you for talking about the Prophet. On the other hand, it shows how wrong they got everything.
Well, what's really remarkable, this global coalition of states, and you have Iran that is in alliance with states that are officially atheistic, the Chinese Communist Party, North Korea, the Russian, rather fascist state, Venezuelan socialism, and so on. How has the regime coordinated with these other totalitarian regimes with their conflicting ideologies? But it seems what they have in common is a hatred of free and open societies, a hatred of the market economy, a hatred of liberal democracy generally.
Absolutely. In fact, it is fascinating how the Islamic Republic has been ignoring the national interest of Iran and Iranian people. Because remember, for example, Russia is a natural competitor to Iran in energy sector, in geopolitics, and everything else. At the same time, Israel is a natural ally to Iran. They have what we need and vice versa. Nonetheless, they have betrayed Iranian people. For example, right before the invasion of Ukraine, there was a comprehensive agreement between the Islamic Republic and Russia. At the time, we didn't know the details of that agreement, but 2.5 weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And immediately, because the Ayatollah, historically, he's very slow to react. He usually waits for the dust to settle because he's very much afraid to make a mistake and say something that turns out to be wrong. So, but in this case, in the case of invasion of Ukraine, he had a statement in his hand. Less than 24 hours later, he came on television and wholeheartedly supported the invasion. And right after him, of course, the president and other high-ranking officials endorsed the invasion of Ukraine. And by doing so, because remember, Iran could supply all the gas that Europe needed. Iran could be, nonetheless, they reached an agreement. They betrayed Iranian people by accepting to Russia that we will not be competing with you on this, and we are not going to sell gas to Europe or anything like that. And of course, later on, it became apparent that they have been supplying missiles and drones and so forth. So they have been, and recently in a report, it came out that Iran has been also using their naval fleet, their ghost fleet, to smuggle not only Iran's oil, but also Venezuela's and Russia's oil. So the cooperation, this coordination continues to the detriment of Iranian people and the world at large, I would say.
Well, we can add the obvious hypocrisy of their close connection with the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing a cultural genocide against the Muslim population of Xinjiang province, Uyghur people who are imprisoned and reconditioned and tortured to abandon their traditional faith. So it seems a clear path to hypocrisy in order just to maintain the grip on power of the current regime.
Absolutely. And if I may add just a quick note, you're absolutely right. In fact, it was such a shame that the Iranian ambassador went there, visited there, and reported that everything is good, people are in good shape. And so basically, he whitewashed all of the criminal acts that the Chinese government has been doing against those people. It was such a shame.
Let's turn then to the political situation and the increasingly open opposition to the regime. But first, I'd like to share that if our participants in the webinar today would like to get an inside look at what our partners are accomplishing around the world every day, our Freedom's Champion magazine is an excellent resource. We're even happy to send a physical copy right to your door when you donate $25 or more. Just click on the link in the chat window to get started. So come back to Mohamad. We've seen videos that are smuggled out of the mass protests against compulsory hijab, refusals to come to compulsory state-sponsored rallies in favor of Hamas, and even teenagers knocking the turbans off of regime-supporting mullahs in public. So how popular is this regime?
According to the surveys done by the regime itself, the regime's 93% of Iranian people disapprove of the regime. 93%. So this is fascinating. And this is interesting because for a long time in the regime, all the surveys showed that 99.9% of people approve. But at some point, they reached a conclusion that these numbers are not helping because we are lying to ourselves. So they had to change, and they had to try and come up with correct numbers. Nonetheless, those numbers become increasingly more embarrassing for the regime. And nonetheless, I think it was Alexei de Tocqueville that said the most dangerous moment for a bad government is when it begins to reform. And the Ayatollah usually is not a fan of Alexei de Tocqueville, but in this specific case, he completely agrees. He considers himself the utmost authority on the Soviet Union, and he has old connections to the Soviet Union. And he believes the reason Soviet Union fell apart was perestroika and glasnost. So he's trying to avoid a perestroika or a glasnost. So basically, he's been not backing down, and the regime has not backing down. They have not been trying to reform or change their ways. In fact, they've been insisting on the old policies. And they recently legislated a new, more strict hijab law that is encroaching even more on personal freedoms of Iranian people. Nonetheless, the current administration says that we cannot really enforce this new law, or we will have a widespread nationwide protest on our hand. So the new law has not been into practice yet. Nonetheless, they are pushing it. And on the other hand, of course, Iranian people are resisting, and they are trying to pick and choose, find the opportunities to protest, and to especially show the international community that the Iranian people do not support this regime.
One thing we've seen, and right here just last month in Syria, how brittle these totalitarian states are. They appear so imposing and strong and powerful. And when they confront individuals one by one, they can commit unspeakable atrocities against them, strike fear into the hearts of people. But when you get a critical mass and people say other people are not supporting the regime, they collapse sometimes overnight. Think of the USSR, what happened right here in Syria. How optimistic are you over the next 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years about the prospects for freedom in Iran?
You're absolutely right. And the thing that I learned from you was that many years ago, that the dictators are come and go. But what matters really is that those ideas of liberty and free society are widespread and widely accepted, endorsed by ordinary people in the country. And I think that is the long war that we have been fighting in Iran and in the Middle East, trying to change the hearts and minds of ordinary people. So when the Ayatollah is gone, we can, after that, rebuild a free society in Iran. And there is hope, because the Ayatollah is advancing age. He's not greatly in shape, and there is no heir apparent to replace him. They tried to do, you remember that the last former president, Raisi, he was next in line to become the next supreme leader. And you remember we were from the same hometown. We clashed on several occasions. He was the head of judiciary. They made him president to hold an elected office before becoming the supreme leader. But his administration was such a disaster that became apparent he couldn't really be the next one. So they don't have any heir apparent. The current Ayatollah lacks legitimacy. He has been trying to promote his son. He hasn't been successful at that. So with widespread popularity of ideas of liberty in Iran, and the coming demise of the current Ayatollah, I am hopeful that maybe after that we can do something.
We have a couple of questions here. I'd like to get back to the work that you and your colleagues are doing in Iran. But John asks, do you consider the Iranian economy to be a form of communism or Sovietism?
Absolutely. And the reason is it's not by accident. Politically speaking, as I mentioned, Ayatollah Khomeini adopted the framework, the Marxist-Leninist framework. And he was, by the way, following, this is a very interesting experiment. He was following one of his idols, Mullah Sadra, one of the biggest Shia Muslim philosophers. He adopted Ash'ari Sunni framework into Shia theology. Khomeini did the same thing with Marxist-Leninism. And he infamously hated the machinery of the government. So he left that part to the university educated, mostly in the West, experts, and all of them happened to be Marxist economists at the time. So they established that. And so that is by design a Marxist economy in Iran. And it is a centrally planned economy through and through, price fixing all the way. Everything in Iran has a fixed price by the government, from the minutiae you can imagine to the most important. And of course, it's not working.
Well, that leads us then to this question about, because you pointed out the role of intellectuals in setting this Marxist foundation for the Iranian tyranny. It's hard to defeat something terrible with nothing. You need some alternative that makes sense to people. What is the work that's being done to lay this foundation, intellectual and moral, for a free Iran?
Of course. When I started, all of the Marxist literature, even the third-rate Marxist literature, was readily available in Iran. But what we know, at the time, I didn't know even this school of thought had a name, but later I learned that it was classical liberalism. Nothing of the classical liberal tradition was available in Iran. Iranian people knew, even at that point, that centrally planned economy doesn't work, resistance economics doesn't work. The corruption, they could see it, they could feel it, the inefficiencies of the regime, they could feel it with every fiber of their being. But they were looking for an alternative, but they didn't know, including myself, they didn't know what that alternative could be. That is why when I started translating, started writing about these ideas, it very soon, I never expected for these ideas to become so popular, so quick in Iran. And to begin with, even identifying as liberal, which at the time was considered to be a curse word, and you would never identify as a liberal. And in fact, some friends have pointed out that, look, there are liberals right after the revolution, but they don't know that that is the label that was created to make those people uncomfortable. They never identified as liberals. They were accused of being liberals, and they rejected liberalism every step of the way. Nonetheless, we have been trying to introduce, to promote, to defend ideas of liberty and of a free society in Iran. And these ideas have been becoming very popular, especially among younger Iranians. So for young Iranians, it is very fashionable to embrace, to talk about ideas of liberty, talk about classical liberalism. And to be honest with you, I'm proud of that.
Well, I know from our friendship and connection over the years how much work you've done, how many books have appeared, websites, articles, public discussions, and so on, to provide an alternative, a viable, sensible alternative to the tyrannical socialist regime, theocratic socialism from which Iranians suffer. And Nyasha poses a question, and that is, what can people who are involved in the free market, pro-liberty movement around the world do to help those inside Iran with tools to struggle against oppression and to advance an open and free society?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to recognize that we have a common enemy. because for a long time it was difficult to convince the international community that this Islamic Republic is not just our Iranian people's enemy, but it will harm even the international community at large. And we have seen that, especially in the past few years, in Israel, in Ukraine, and in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere. So recognize to begin with that we have a common enemy, and it is valuable to support institutions such as Atlas Network, who have been helping us, supporting us for a long time, for nearly 2 decades, without taking any credits, which is unbelievable. This is my chance to say that out loud, that I truly appreciate it, your support for such a long time, and your help and wisdom because, to be honest, to begin with, we had no idea how to deal with the regime, but you had the know-how, you had the experience of dealing with similar regimes before us. So it has been invaluable. And so first, recognize we have a common enemy. Second, support institutions such as Atlas Network, who have been historically firmly supporting us.
Well, we have one last question before we wrap up, and that is Abdul Hadi from Pakistan says he's heard that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the enforcers of the regime, are the main economic beneficiaries of the regime. What's your response?
That is true to an extent. After the war of Iran-Iraq war concluded, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, were allowed into the economy. They were given contracts, of course, all sorts of exemptions and benefits. And over time, they have their modus operandi, the Islamic Republic, is I usually have hesitation to use the fascist word, but in this case, it is applicable. So basically, they support the organizations and companies that can benefit the state. And IRGC is the main proponent of that structure. So IRGC has influence over a large part of Iran's economy. Even many private companies that you hear them as private companies, like, for example, Tondar Sahra, the same company that sold missiles and drones to Russia, the same company was recently caught red-handed smuggling Iran's oil. And if that is not sufficient, in the past couple of years, when the sanctions became more strict, IRGC has been the main smuggler of Iranian oil. And in fact, they receive a large part of their budget, not in the devalued Iranian rial, but in crude oil, according to the law of the land, I mean. So they have influence, large influences in Iranian economy.
This is actually a common feature, as Anne Applebaum has pointed out in her book, Autocracy Incorporated, between the Maduro regime, the Cuban regime, the Russian regime, the Iranian regime, and so on. Despite superficially different and opposed ideologies, what they have in common is that the thugs who run them enrich themselves and become staggeringly wealthy through acts of theft, through confiscation of other people's property, from the usual corruption, and basically using the state as a resource for their enrichment. And it seems Iran is no different in that regard. Stephen asks a question about how free are young Iranians to use technology to communicate, and do you see this changing?
Well, all the social media platforms in Iran are blocked by the regime. However, Iranian people, especially young Iranians, are very good at going around these limits. And of course, we have domestic platforms inside Iran as well. So Iranian people are very active. Young Iranians are very active. They know how to go around these limitations. And that has been playing a very important part in our work in Iran, of course, and continues to be very important to us.
So I remember our communications when you were in Iran via encrypted apps, and how important that was, and how careful one had to be in case the police were to find you and demand to look through your phone. Is this becoming somehow easier for young people today to be able to hide their communications from the secret police and from the other enforcement arms of the regime?
Unfortunately, the regime has become increasingly more violent when it comes to that sort of things. However, the number of people resisting and openly challenging the legitimacy of the regime has grown to a degree that because back in the day, 20 years ago, a handful of people would speak out and they immediately were cracked on, they were immediately captured and interrogated and so forth. But nowadays, we are talking about tens of millions of people. So the regime cannot really crack down on everybody. Well, of course, select few, especially notable people who are known or have a high reputation, they are in more danger. Nonetheless, they cannot really capture, they cannot really imprison tens of millions of people. So it is a very uncomfortable situation for the regime. Nonetheless, they continue to be even more violent in cracking down on that sort of things.
But I've been here in Syria with Syrian classical liberals and Friends of Liberty, some of whom returned to the country from exile, as well as other partners from the Arab world, partners in Atlas Network who are here to provide expertise and advice and moral support. One of the things that's so striking about Syrians is their hopefulness and the desire to look to the future rather than dwell in the past and only worry about the horrors that they experienced, which were very, very real and very serious, but a commitment to say, we want to close that chapter and live for the future and think of the future of our children and of the young people. What's your take in a nutshell on what's happened in Syria and its significance for the region and the world?
Absolutely. I think this very similar trend is becoming increasingly more popular in Iran as well. Maybe the biggest trend in Iranian social media was a demand for a normal life, which is unbelievable. Nonetheless, young Iranians are demanding a normal life. They want to have, and you wouldn't realize how anti-state that statement is, because Ayatollah Khomeini infamously rejected material life in favor of a higher purpose. Now the young generation, they don't care about those higher causes. They don't care about this apocalyptic interpretation of radical jihadist Islamism or anything like that. They want a normal life. And they try to look to the future. They just want the liberty to choose the way they want to live and live according to their own volition. But that the Ayatollah cannot really respect or understand that, and he will fight this to his last breath, I'm sure.
Well, it's auspicious for the future of liberty. I remember when I was in Czechoslovakia in 1989, and as the revolution was gearing up there, and a common slogan was, we want to live in a normal society. Something pretty basic, not shocking. We just want to live normal lives. And it was very powerful and brought out thousands and thousands of people in the street, and that communist regime collapsed. And the result has been prospering, flourishing, normal society where people can live their lives. It's a beautiful vision. Certainly after the experience of all these apocalyptic, messianic religions of socialism and communism and Baathism and all the tyranny that they brought that ended up being so petty and vicious and cruel, nothing like what was promised at the beginning. Well, I'd like to thank you, Mohamad, for your time, but also for your dedication of your courage, of your energy, of your life, which you put at risk many times, and your powerful intellect to the cause of liberty. It's really inspiring to be able to work with you and your colleagues in Iran and who are spread throughout the worldwide Iranian diaspora, all of whom are working for a future of liberty, peace, toleration, dignity, and prosperity. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today for a wide-ranging discussion of Iran, a country that is yearning for freedom, and the implications for the wider region and world. And also to our participants, if you'd like to take a deeper dive and get to know our network of independent partner organizations, all of whom are dedicated in their own ways to advancing individual liberty and economic freedom in their particular context, I invite you to become a sponsor of Atlas Network and to be updated regularly on the impressive work of this network of partners. You'll find yourself inspired by a global network of friends who are motivated by the principles of liberty, the rule of law, toleration, and free enterprise. I hope that you'll join the cause of liberty with a donation to Atlas Network by visiting the link that's been shared to all of you to support the work of people struggling for liberty from California to Colombia, from Iran to Taiwan, from Uganda to Ukraine. That's all we have time for today. Thank you again for joining us. And until next time, stay free.